we see from this election in Argentina, we see Iran deepening its economic ties with Russia now with this free trade agreement, but also linking itself to China. We see the wider Eurasian integration. We see now Russia's economic return to the Middle East, as we also in Saudi Arabia and UAE. This is quite putting on a bit of a spectacular show. And if we have time, of course, we'd like to look also at some of the solutions, if it's possible, to some of the economic and political challenges today, such as the sustainability of U.S. debt and the stability of the dollar, which I guess while many would like to see it had a lower or more weaker status in the world, collapse would be horrible probably for everyone. So, but if you don't mind, I thought we could start with Argentina, because for me this case is very strange. A hard time making sense of it. Obviously, Argentina has a lot of problem with inflation and other economic problems, so I can understand the appetite for radical reforms. But the election of Javier Milei is very radical, I think, even radical for Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. So how do you interpret this? Why has Argentina had so many economic problems to begin with, and what do you make of his solutions? Are they accurate solution to this problem?
The story of Argentina goes back 2 centuries. This is a very complicated place that has added more zeros to the price level than any other country in the world. Its next door neighbor, Brazil, comes in second. So Argentina, in the course of its 2 centuries of independence, has done everything you can do to money, period. It's had new currencies, old currencies, depreciated currencies, hyperinflations repeatedly, defaults repeatedly. So it's a kind of a mystery at some fundamental level why such a well-resourced country, many educated people, a country that was one of the richest in the world a century ago, has been in so much tumult. And when I was studying economics 50 years ago, as I began my freshman year at university, the great economic historian of the day in Harvard University was a man named Simon Kuznets, who invented to a substantial extent the national income accounts, the GDP and the other parts of the national income accounts, and he won the Nobel Prize for it. But he, maybe apocryphally, but the story was that he opened his course each year saying there are 4 types of countries. There are the developed economies, there are the developing economies, there is Japan, and there is Argentina. Now, what that meant was, at the time, Japan was the miracle economy. We would say that maybe about China now. And Argentina already, this was 50 years ago, was the country constantly in crisis. So one of the things about crisis is that if you have had repeated financial crises, you are prone to having more of them, because everybody is always on guard to get out of the national currency before it loses all value. So Argentina is a country of macroeconomists. The taxi drivers are macroeconomists, the storekeepers are macroeconomists. They all have dollars and pesos. They're always ready. They're looking every moment. Will there be a political crisis? Will our currency lose value? And you end up with a lot of self-fulfilling catastrophes. A self-fulfilling catastrophe is when something bad happens because something bad is expected to happen. And if the currency is expected to lose value, then people flee the currency and drive down its value, thereby confirming the fear. And in certain circumstances, with fragile economies, and Argentina is the most classic case, that fear becomes self-confirming on an ongoing basis. And I can tell you a story. I was trying to help not the previous finance minister, but the finance minister just before him, a man named Martin Guzman, a professional, a very decent man. And he was battling an inflation rate of 40 or 50% per year. And Argentina had a large debt, but actually not, I shouldn't even say that. It had a relatively small debt, but since nobody trusts Argentina, no one would lend it new money. So as the old debt was coming due, a government would normally borrow new money to pay off the old money and keep the debt level pretty much the same. But Argentina has no friends, nobody trusts it. So as the Argentine debt was coming due, everyone wanted to be repaid. Thank you, no more loans. So I was trying to help, since part of my work over the last 40 years has been in economic emergencies, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with their bank creditors, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with the International Monetary Fund. And I said, oh God, this is tough. Nobody believes in Argentina, least of all the Argentines. So after these agreements were reached, I flew to Buenos Aires and I met in a large room with Argentina's poobahs, the powers and shakers. And I said, your situation is not as bad as you think. Your debt is actually not so high. Your need for the central bank to print money is actually not so high. It's just that nobody trusts you. So if we could regain trust, believe me, your balance sheet is actually better than the U.S. government. It's just that in the U.S., everybody uses the dollar, so you could run big budget deficits. But Argentina's budget deficit was smaller than the U.S., and Argentina's inflation soared because everyone was always ready to run out of the peso. Okay, so I said, just rebuild trust. I felt pretty good. Compelling speech, showed the data, showed that the U.S. is worse at a fundamental level than Argentina. Flew home, and within days, the finance minister basically resigned because his own political party more or less disowned him after he had gotten these agreements. Oh my God. Okay, he's gone. Inflation soars again. And so all that handiwork of saying, there's a way to get out of this, be careful, evaporated. And the inflation eventually rose to more than 100% per year, which is pretty high, although I've dealt with countries in thousands of percent per year. But it was sufficiently high that the Argentines said in this election, we don't want to hear anything about any standard politician. We want something completely new. And the incoming president promised something completely new, specifically to adopt the dollar. And it's probably not going to happen because quickly they backtrack. We don't even have dollars. We can't tie our future to a currency in which we have no reserves. We couldn't back the banking system and so forth. I've not spoken with the new government, although I know the incoming finance minister quite well. I plan to speak with them. The long and the short of it is this is just chronic crisis. So I wouldn't draw too much about general facts from Argentina, because basically almost any time between 1823 and 2023, you could have found the country in crisis. And I've dealt with already in my career with a number of presidents of Argentina. And they don't have the internal political capacity to overcome this yet. So all of this is to say, Argentina, endlessly fascinating, a little bit bizarre. Hopefully they'll get out of it this time. What's interesting now geopolitically is that the outgoing government had joined the BRICS. And that is a good thing and an important thing for Argentina, because it brings Argentina and the next door giant Brazil together, which is very good for South America, very important diplomatically, very important geopolitically. The incoming government has said, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with China because Milei is being portrayed as an ardent Americanist, so on the American side of this bloc politics. My message to the Argentines is, look, China's your major customer. Don't be dumb. don't go with the U.S. in this sense. Trade with the U.S., trade with China. Don't get into this crazy mentality of one side or another. And by the way, in this world today, if you have to choose one side or another, I wouldn't go with the American side. Every time a country sides with the United States these days, it ends up in disaster, like Ukraine, because the U.S. is a fading empire. It can't sustain all its promises, not even close. It can't even keep its own public institutions functioning anymore. So my message to the Argentines is you don't have to choose sides. Just be nice, but don't break relations with China, for heaven's sake. Join the BRICS. It's a good thing to do. And maybe within the BRICS efforts this year, which are very important efforts to create non-dollar payments, there'll be something in it for Argentina. That I'm going to try to explain to them. There really is some good news for Argentina in the fact that it won't just be the dollar in the world, that there will be alternative payments, and Argentina shouldn't close itself off from what's going to be an important new force in international monetary economics.
That's all very interesting, because one of the things that I noticed, which has not been mentioned, I think, widely, is that Putin, of course, has just been to the UAE and he's just been to the Saudi Arabia, and he came with a very, very big and very strong delegation of people. And I noticed that one of the people who was there was, of course, Nabulina, who is the central bank chair. And both Saudi
I didn't realize she was on the trip, but that is a very interesting part.
It was interesting because I don't think it was announced, but there was a list of, you saw the picture of all the people in Riyadh, and they were all shaking hands. And one of the people who was there and who shook their hands was none other than Nabulina. So she was there. And of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both joining the BRICS in a few weeks. So is Iran. The Iranian president has just been to Moscow. He's had discussions there with Putin. There's just been this announcement of this free trade agreement. And then at the same time, Putin gave this speech at an investment forum run by VTB. And a disproportionate amount of that discussion was about the financial architecture. He was saying that, in fact, that seemed to be the most important thing, that you need to get the financial architecture right domestically in order to move forward. But he was also talking about the new financial architecture. And he said some very interesting things about how the existing financial architecture, which is Western-based, is becoming outdated and obsolescent, also in a technological sense. So you have Nabulina there in all of these meetings, and she's presumably talking about all of these matters. She seems to be very interested in them. And she's talking with the big oil producers. And Iran is also a big oil producer. And at the same time, you have all these discussions from Putin about financial systems. And I wonder whether this adds up.
Yeah, the trip was absolutely fascinating, incredibly skillful of Putin at this moment. And it reflects actually three major geopolitical points, all, I think, rather ingeniously brought together. One of them is OPEC Plus, of course. OPEC plus Russia constitutes an enormous part of the hydrocarbons market of the world, and they do a lot of important business together in this, in managing the oil and gas market. So that's one part of the trip. Another part of the trip is clearly regional, which is the integration of Russia with Central Asia, with the Arabian Peninsula, with the Middle East more generally. And you look at the map, and between Russia, China, Central Asia, Arabia, this is building, and of course, India is a member of the BRICS. This is really building most of Eurasia into an integrated geopolitical and economic huge part of the world. And so very, very deft in that regard also. A basic principle of economics, a fundamental principle is neighbors should get along. They trade well with each other. They share ecosystems with each other. And that's the principle that Putin is following because Iran is a neighbor. The Middle East is a neighbor. This is very smart. And then the third dimension, in addition to the oil and the neighborhood, is, of course, the BRICS. And the BRICS started out as the five: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It had already reached an output level measured at what we call purchasing power prices or at international prices larger than the G7. That is geopolitically and economically notable. But now the five are being joined by six more, presumably. Argentina, that's the new addition in South America. Egypt and Ethiopia in Africa, and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran in the Middle East region. Now, you add the six to the original five, you have 37% of world output, according to the IMF purchasing power data, compared to 29 to 30% for the G7. This is a different world, and this is really powerful. And what the BRICS are discussing this year, in particular, is exactly this financial architecture. And of course, that was greatly hastened by the absolutely awful and mistaken U.S. policies on the dollar. So the U.S. has what Charles de Gaulle, already President de Gaulle, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, called the exorbitant privilege, which is that the dollar is used for about 60% of international transactions of all kinds. The way you denominate a contract, the way you pay to settle a contract, the way governments hold their foreign exchange reserves. So on all three major dimensions of international currency, the dollar predominates. Not exclusively, but overwhelming. And that gives the U.S. a huge advantage. You don't run out of the dollar to what? To the dollar. And so it's not like Argentina, where everyone's sitting on the edge as the U.S. debt reaches 100% of GDP. If Argentine debt ever came close to 100% of GDP, they'd be out the door in a moment. But with the U.S. being the currency of the world, nobody flees the dollar. So that's the exorbitant privilege that you get to borrow. You can pump up the money supply. You get some inflation, but you don't get what Argentina or just about any other emerging economy would get. But the U.S. just couldn't leave good enough alone. It had to weaponize the dollar. And this has really it's become an addiction. The U.S. generally is addicted to regime change. The U.S. generally is addicted to a foreign policy that says, I don't like you, I want to replace you. Send in the CIA or send in an army, but we get to choose who your government is. Now, this is absolutely disastrous foreign policy, in my view, completely against the UN Charter, completely against international law, but that's the core. And the U.S. figured out 10 or 15 years ago that it could use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. And the main way that it uses it is in a very crude way, which is to say, one day, your dollars are now our dollars, thank you. Your dollars literally means you have accounts in U.S. banks or U.S. controlled banks. That's what a dollar is in effect, M2 definition of a dollar. So you're holding dollar accounts in institutions that we control. And what the U.S. has come to do increasingly frequently is freeze the money of other countries, of their central banks, no less, of their state enterprises. And the United States did this with Venezuela. Absolutely absurd, but one day Trump and his minions got the idea that they will declare who's the real president of Venezuela, not the actual president of Venezuela, but they named someone from the Venezuelan parliament as president and said, okay, that guy's president. That actually lasted for a few years. And you could see the power of the United States. It's like the emperor with no clothes. About 40 countries said, now Mr. Guaido is president, not Mr. Maduro, who's actually president. So you could see a measure of the U.S. influence that other countries would follow this nonsense. But in the process, they said, Mr. Maduro is no longer president, because we said so, and he no longer has access to the foreign exchange reserves of the country. We give that to this other one. Well, this is absolutely crazy. Even the IMF couldn't, I shouldn't say even the IMF. The IMF couldn't figure this out. It doesn't have the gumption to say to the United States, that's ridiculous. So, no, we have a big issue. Who really controls the foreign exchange reserves? So these games went on for years. Of course, with Russia, it's much more serious than that. The United States froze its estimated $300 billion of Russian financial assets. That's a lot of money, by the way. That was the trick that was going to bring Russia to its knees. It didn't do so, but that's what they thought. We've got Putin cornered. We've got Russia cornered. We'll bring them to their knees by freezing their assets and locking them out of the U.S. banking system, the so-called SWIFT settlement system. Well, Russia quickly figured out, very cleverly, we can trade with China and renminbi. We can trade with India and rupees. A little bit shakier on that front. We can find other ways to transact. And to make maybe a short story long as I have, this year Russia is the leader of the BRICS. The BRICS summit will be in Kazan next October, I believe it is. And so Russia chairs the process, and it's chairing an expert group to come up with non-dollar payments. This is smart. And I kept telling my friends in the US government, don't abuse the dollar. It's going to go away. Because in monetary economics, the first thing you teach is the real economy is the real thing, what you produce, what the factories are. There are many ways to make a settlement, even barter, of course, but there are many currencies you can use. So don't think that your currency brings another country to its knees, because the other country's economy is the real economy. The ability to produce steel, the ability to produce weapons or artillery, the ability to produce automobiles or chips or whatever it is, or oil. And the United States misunderstood that, but really abused the privilege of the dollar. And the dollar will absolutely lose its role in centrality in the international payment system in the coming decade. In monetary economics, just to mention, all my colleagues look at history and say it's a long, slow decline of a currency. And the most famous case is the British pound, which used to be the core of the international monetary and financial system in the 19th century until basically the Great Depression. But the fact is, and so they say, look, the pound hung in there even after Germany was larger, even after the United States was larger, even after Britain's share of the world economy had declined. London remained the center of the international system. But it's not going to happen the same way with the dollar, because it's just too easy technologically to do things differently. And so we will have at least an international renminbi at a minimum playing a big role. And we could have a kind of BRICS, if not central bank, a BRICS monetary fund that serves the role of giving liquidity and credits among the BRICS countries in a way which will mean a non-dollar settlement system.
Professor Sachs, there's a few things. As a person in Britain, I can say that the long decline of sterling after Britain lost its hegemonic position in the world economy was an absolute disaster for Britain. You would not want to go through that process again.
And by the way, it's quite interesting just to say the way it manifested. Of course, World War I was awful. The return to gold in 1926 overvalued Britain in the world economy. And Keynes wrote one of his most famous essays in 1926 called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, who happened to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1926 that put this mistake into place. The 1930s were the Great Depression. World War II, of course, devastating. And the point is, by the end of World War II, Britain had basically gone deeply into debt, even with its own colonies, which became independent countries. And so Britain never quite got out of debtor status again. And it was a very, very heavy, long, painful period. Britain, the center of the world, going to the new International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. I mean, unthinkable. But, the United States, can you imagine going to the IMF for a loan? It's not impossible. This is exactly what you're referring to.
Absolutely. I remember it. I was in London, of course, when it happened. I can remember the Chancellor turning back at the airport, and he had to rush off to Washington to raise funds. And, of course, the fact that we had this currency, which was still an international currency, was doing immense damage to the British domestic economy, which I think people don't understand. So in some ways, it might actually be better for the United States, I would have thought, to go through it quickly than have it, drawn out in the way that it was with Britain. I'm not, by the way, saying that's going to happen, and I'm not making those points. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. If it's a long process, it's a long agony. It's not based on the British experience.
So, we will have non-dollar payments in the BRICS. That's clearly high on the mind, not only of President Putin, obviously, but also President Lula, who every day asks, and he's the chair of the G20 this year, as well as being a BRICS member. Why are we dealing with Russia in dollars, for heaven's sake? And he's very sensible, very logical. And we will move to new payments arrangements, and they will do just fine. Thank you. That will be the real lesson.
What is your take of the article written by Mr. Hirsch? And especially noting that you were one of the first people, basically a week after the explosion last year, you suggested that it was the Americans, it was the Biden administration that carried out the bombing. Basically, the similar conclusion that Mr. Hirsch came to.
I think the Hirsch article is very credible. And while it has been rejected by the US and other governments, they haven't provided any single detail disputing the article. It's just been a flat rejection, saying this is a fantasy, this is false, but they haven't told any alternative, and they haven't shown any single fact that is wrong in the Hirsch account. So for the moment, I think Seymour Hirsch has not only a lot of credibility of a lifetime of investigative reporting, but has a credibility that comes from the fact that his points have not been refuted, and I must say they make a lot of sense. Here's what we know about this that's really important. This terrorist attack had to be carried out at state level. This is a very hard to do attack. The pipeline sits under roughly 90 meters of sea level. It is a big, thick, heavy steel encased in even bigger, thicker concrete. It needed a lot of explosives in order to blow up the 3 of the 4 pipelines. Apparently, part of the event did not succeed, in fact, because clearly the intention was to blow up all 4 of the pipelines. But that shows how hard this was technically. So there are only a very few governments that could do this. The United States obviously being one. Perhaps the governments immediately in that region It could be UK, Norway, Sweden, or Russia. But then you start to ask the question, okay, is it Russia? Two facts I think are important. First, Russia had no incentive whatsoever to blow up its own infrastructure. And second, now several months after the event, the Western intelligence agencies are actually saying quietly, but reported in the Washington Post of all places, that there is zero evidence that Russia had anything to do with this. To my mind, that leaves the United States, UK, as I say, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Poland, perhaps as those who carried it out. I can assure you that if any of the others carried it out, they did it with the knowledge and cooperation of the United States. This was a difficult technical feat. You don't just dive down 90 meters, put on C4 explosives, and blow up massive pipelines. This requires tremendous technological capacity. It requires cover because this is a region that is heavily monitored by US and other intelligence and military services. So you have to have deep cover to be able to carry this out. And then finally, I would just come to motive and statements. American politicians hated Nord Stream. They hated Nord Stream 2. There wasn't almost a day that went by when they said what a disgraceful project Nord Stream is. On February 7th, 2022, President Biden famously said in a press briefing together with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, if Russia invades, Nord Stream 2 is over. And the reporter asked him, Mr. President, how can you say that? This is not a US project. This is a Russia-German project. How do you say that? He said, believe me, we have our ways. After the event, the US Secretary of State said this was a tremendous opportunity to wean Europe off of Russian energy. Strange statement if you are concerned about international terrorism on international infrastructure. Right. And then more recently than that, the Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, said how delighted she and the administration are that Nord Stream 2 is a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. Yeah. It's not the way to speak about an event that has massive danger and massive potential repercussions. We need safe infrastructure on the seabed. We need it for our internet. We need it for our energy system. We need it for power transmission. We should not have anybody blowing up international infrastructure, and we should not have anybody saying how delighted they are that it was done.
Yeah, this is incredible in many different ways, as you have pointed out. First of all, the source with the direct knowledge to the operational planning called this an act of war. You can hate a pipeline, you can hate an enemy, a country, a government, but to actually do it, to actually go and carry out this whole thing after 9 months of meticulous and clandestine discussion, debates, and preparation, and all the maneuvering, and actually do it. This is just unbelievable. I mean, the United States talk about rule of law, rule-based international order, that country need to be democratic whatsoever, and deep down, this is something that the Biden administration carried out. It's really taking it to an unprecedented level in my eyes.
Let me say the following. First, I'm not absolutely sure that it is this way, but I think the evidence is overwhelming in this direction right now. What I'm really advocating is that the UN Security Council investigate this as a very high priority, because there's another extraordinarily weird part of this story, which is that Sweden investigated what happened, sent divers down, and then declared that they would not share the information with anybody. not with their own public, not with their parliament, not with their neighbors, Germany and Denmark, not with the UN Security Council. That's a disgrace, I'm sorry to say. If Sweden knows something about who did this, they have a responsibility to the world, to multilateralism, to the world's safety, to report to the UN Security Council on a threat to the peace such as this. But they haven't said a word. Apparently, Denmark and Germany have also carried out investigations, and they don't tell their own parliaments about this. I believe the United States
behind it.
I think the likely thing behind it is that they're hiding the U.S. role in this. That's what stands to reason. There may be something else, but there is no possible explanation of why they are not sharing this information.
After they concluded, both Sweden and Denmark, that the pipelines were deliberately blown up. They actually said that.
They know a lot. They know the kinds of explosives that were used. I worry that Sweden's role actually was to clean up the crime scene. I think they may have taken away evidence that others could have come and said, oh, look who did this, that we now know for sure. I think they cleaned up the crime scene. They need to tell the world, what did they find? This is Sweden, after all. Be responsible to the international community. So I would say, if in fact the US did this, I would say two things. First, sad to say, not for the first time, because the US got into a very bad habit, now I'm speaking more generally, of covert operations. And since 1947, with the National Security Act, the US has been engaged in countless covert operations, many of extraordinary irresponsibility. Second, if it in fact did this one, the world needs to know and the world needs to follow up.
And also, I was going to ask the fact that they could celebrate this act. Let's not forget that this is not just infrastructure which belongs to Russia. It also belongs to Germany, which is part of, is a very strong ally to the United States, and it's the German industries or Western European industries and ordinary households that would be affected when these pipelines are off, because it's affordable natural gas coming from Russia, not from the United States, of course. And the fact that the US, both the Secretary of State, as I said, and Anthony Blinken would say this was a potentially good opportunity, and
even more than that, he said a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good one. He basically, they celebrate how they could go out and say such things and not expect the world to suspect, okay, who are benefiting from this explosion? Are they smart? Are they too smart, or are they too stupid to make such public statements?
These statements are horrible statements. What's sad is that they play to American politicians. You did not have an uproar in the United States after these statements were made, but we should have. And the sad fact is it's not even whether it's owned by Russia or owned by Germany. Those facts matter. But it's even more general than that. Our world cannot function if individual countries, governments, are secretly blowing up the infrastructure in the public way. We depend on submarine cables for internet, for the functioning of our economies, for power, for gas transmission, for many, many things. And what's absolutely vital if we're going to succeed in fighting climate change, for example, is we're going to need trans-boundary, cross-national transmission of electricity made by renewable energy, for example. But if countries get the idea, I can't afford to rely on a long distance transmission line, somebody may blow it up. What kind of world are we going to be in? We're not going to be able to carry out any of the things we want to carry out if we have so much destroyed international trust. That's why, by the way, I think it's extremely important that whoever did it be investigated fully, and I hope the full story is told. And I believe that the right place for this investigation is the UN Security Council. And if one country says, no investigation, that would be pretty odd. So let's see if that happens, because that could happen.
That could happen. It's funny, but it's really sad if you think about it. How many times can, let's say, the United States, when it carries out an international action, be it international terrorism or an invasion, that the United States is held to account, that it pays a price for it. I don't really remember many incidents in history where this is the case. Are you optimistic that there is going to be some kind of serious investigation where a transparent investigation can be carried out and the real culprits can be brought to the fore and held accountable? Is that going to happen at all? Because we are talking about the most powerful country, one who is willing to use force or whatever means necessary to benefit, to, serve its own political or whatever benefits.
I'm pretty optimistic that the truth is going to come out and be understood. And I think Seymour Hersh's piece is a major step in that direction. The fact that we now, after the piece has been disseminated, have not heard any single point refuted of that piece is very telling. And so I think we have a lot of reason, more and more each day, to say that he probably got it almost all right. No one's even picked little holes in it in the U.S. government.
They're not talking about it, but the Western media is not talking about it so much.
Well, one of the weirdest things is that our supposed major press, like the New York Times, as far as I know, has not even mentioned this Hersh story once. That's a disgrace. And this is part of what America believes right now, what the American government believes is if we say something, it's not going to be discussed, and that's going to be the end of it. But the rest of the world isn't following that. The rest of the world saying, how strange. This is really strange. We need to hear something more from the U.S. You can't just deny it. You must know something about this, yes? Oh, you haven't looked into it? You don't know anything about it? But you're so happy about it, but you don't know who did it? Come on. Nobody would believe any of this for a moment. And so I'm pretty confident that in this case, the truth is coming out more and more. Maybe somebody in the Swedish government will leak what they know, or someone in Norway or Germany. Lots of people know what's going on right now. Lots of people. Somebody more will talk, and more will find out, most likely, that what Seymour Hersh has written is basically correct.
What is the significance of the Chinese vision for how to achieve global security on such a juncture?
What China has been saying about the Ukraine war and this new document and new security initiative are extremely important. China recognized from the very start that there were true security interests on both sides, Ukraine and Russia, that need to be observed in order for this war to end, and that they can be observed, that they should be reflected and respected through dialogue and negotiation, and that continued war and escalation was dangerous, devastating for Ukraine, and unnecessary. The principles that China has put forward, in my mind, are correct. China understood that this was a war that has underlying political provocations. In my opinion, the U.S. intention to enlarge its military alliance, NATO, to Ukraine and to Georgia, crossed an essential Russian red line, and in my view, an understandable Russian red line. The United States participated in the overthrow of a duly elected constitutional president of Ukraine in February 2014, we're actually not at the first anniversary of this war. We're at the 9th anniversary of this war, because the war started with the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, and then fighting broke out. Russia also then took Crimea. The fighting in the Donbass broke out. NATO, especially the United States, sent massive amounts of armaments to Ukraine. And so we're in the 9th year of escalation. And what China has been very clear about, I must say, all through this, and China has had good relations with Ukraine and good relations with Russia. It's not on one side or another. It has said that there is underlying politics and that the security interests of both sides need to be respected. I believe that that's the case as well. I have said, not only from the first day of this invasion a year ago, or even for the years since 2014, NATO should not enlarge to Ukraine and Georgia, because that is a security red line of Russia that is understandable, and that if this were in a U.S. context of a foreign power making military alliances along the U.S. border, I guarantee the reaction would not be a happy or pleasant one. And so we should have prudence, wisdom, judgment, common sense to back off from war. But instead we don't. We just have total finger pointing, no dialogue at all. Biden has not picked up the phone to speak with Putin since the war started. That is remarkable, because the whole world suffers from this war, and the two should be speaking. And not speaking to a camera, just making public remarks, but speaking about how to end the conflict without further escalation and further devastation of Ukraine. So I am hoping that China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, other major countries that are saying, stop escalating. You're killing Ukraine, literally. And at the same time, you're threatening the whole world, that the voices of leading countries that are not in this conflict will push the United States and Russia to negotiation and to understand each other's red lines, which has been a missing factor all along. Mutual respect and prudence will keep us safe.
We are also approaching the 20th anniversary of the launch of the US invasion of Iraq. 20 years later, after the invasion, Iraq is still in a very volatile state. I mean, the country proves to be much more difficult to be rebuilt than to destroy a government, than to destroy a regime. There are many different theories as to why the United States went into Iraq. Nevertheless, they went in using crook means, basically. You know, the excuse, the pretense was notorious by now. 20 years later, how do you look at that? And how do you think the United States has achieved what they said they wanted to achieve, which is to bring freedom and promote democracy to Iraq and Middle East?
The Iraq War was a disaster, and it was first and foremost a disaster for Iraq. It was a disaster and tragedy for the United States. Trillions of dollars of money and lives wasted for nothing but destruction. And it was so predictable. In fact, I did predict it, and many others did as well. I remember listening to our then Secretary of State testifying in the UN Security Council, Colin Powell, and I knew this was not true. You could listen carefully with an experienced ear and know this was not the evidence on which to base a war. And I remember being on U.S. television that evening in a round table. There were 6 of us. 5 were very enthusiastic about the war about to begin. And I said, these are false pretenses. And the interviewer looked me in the eye. Are you saying the Secretary of State is not telling the truth? And I said, yes, I am saying that.
Wow.
This is not right. And I wrote soon afterwards, because the bombing started and the shock and awe, and there was so much enthusiasm in the United States. And I wrote that all of those bombs from 35,000 feet are not only by themselves leading to destruction, but solve nothing. Wait till America is on the ground there, and then you're going to see the truth of what you have started. And of course, it turned into a disaster. Of course, first and foremost for Iraq itself. America has a way of doing this, unfortunately, because America has believed throughout my whole lifetime that military force can solve political problems. This is a falsehood, period. They believed it in Vietnam. They believed it in Cambodia. They believed it in Lao PDR. They believed it in Nicaragua. They believed it in Iraq twice.
How is that? What is in the American gene? What is in the American culture that they have this trait of bombing the hell out of a place and hoping that the local people are going to like them, are going to like what they have to offer. Meanwhile, they have a lot of problems at home, which are broadcast live all over the world.
It is a tragedy. It is, to use an old expression that is completely inadequate to your question, when a person has a hammer, they think everything is a nail. So the U.S. has a hammer. There's no doubt it's got a big military. And it thinks that it can pound on the head of anyone and get a solution. And it never works. I'm 68 years old. I've been through all of these wars, massive failures, one after another, debacles, trillions of dollars wasted, so many people killed. But I also know, it's sorry to say, America, with these 2 oceans that separated from the rest of the world, knows very little about the places that they arm or that they bomb. They know nothing about the geography, the history.
Tell me more about what exactly is China's modernization. What you saw there would help us to understand what exactly it is.
Thank you very much. I was lucky to watch the modernization close up because I first visited China in 1981, which was just the start of the fast growth period. We didn't know it then. And of course, I've come many times a year, most years ever since then. So from 1981 until today, I watched. In the early 2000s, I was asked by the government officials also to look at the challenges of Western China. So I saw this firsthand. What I saw was a country that went from poverty to prosperity, poverty to wealth in this 40 years. It is a most amazing story. It's a most amazing accomplishment. It is, I believe, also the guideposts for what will help Africa in its next 40-year journey to accomplish a similar task, which is ending extreme poverty. I think that there are 3 big challenges right now in the world in which China is right at the center. The first is the ecological challenge. We know that we have to have a different kind of energy system, a different kind of industry, because the kind that we have based on fossil fuels has led us to really the precipice of extreme environmental damage and danger. So transformation is number one. The second big issue is China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, has recognized quite deeply, and also through the Global Development Initiative recently, that China's future is inextricably linked with development throughout the world. This is right. China will be a major exporter to the developing countries. China will be a major provider of financing for those countries. China will be a major builder of the infrastructure throughout the world. So this is the second big challenge. And the third big challenge is, unfortunately, China's success triggered an adverse reaction in the United States. I think a completely wrong-headed and dangerous one. But American strategists have come to see China as a threat to American primacy. Oh, well, I tell them, so what? This is not a matter of primacy. This is a matter of global well-being and global cooperation. Stop thinking in win-lose terms. But unfortunately, this relationship is now fraught with problems, and it is really important that the U.S. and China find a path to cooperation. Yes, I think the question is, first of all, to move beyond the conventional measurements. So I would like to know about the clean air, the low carbon, the longevity of healthy lives, and so forth. I think that this is what the common prosperity idea in China is really about. And I think for all our economies, we're going to have to get past some of our hang-ups with the current measurements, which have led us to a very dirty, rather unequal, and not so happy quality of life. Let me just point out that in the United States, we get richer and richer, and life expectancy continues to decline now. We're back to life expectancy of 25 years ago. This is dreadful. The population is sick. It's being poisoned by bad diets. It's not being measured properly. So I would like to see all of our economies, but since China is so good at this, about thinking at about the future, to think about what really matters for the quality of life, for the distribution of the goods and services that we need, for the protection of the environment, but also, I think it's inevitable. China's so big and so influential in the world that China is going to be a leader globally of this new direction. That's a good thing. I think the Belt and Road Initiative, in my personal view, should be expanded. I know there's some skepticism, but it's a terrific initiative, and it should actually be expanded because we need to build out a high quality of life infrastructure for the 21st century, and I think the Belt and Road Initiative can really help to do that. One of the reasons why this is so complicated is that we are at the end of the Western-led world economy, so we're really into something new, and that's also what Professor Singh was emphasizing. For 250 years, all the yardsticks came from Britain or the United States or the so-called Western world. That was always a historical anomaly, because for almost all of human history, it's been India and China and Asia that was the pace setter for Europe, not the other way around. And now we're in a very exciting world, I think. Dangerous, yes, but exciting in that we are no longer in a Western-led world. We're in a multipolar world, and I was very happy to hear Professor Singh talk about this reaching for the cultural base of well-being in different civilizations, because we're really seeing a lot of that discussion emerging. Of course, China has announced, and I think it's very exciting, a Global Civilizations Initiative, and President Xi has spoken about the need to look to the cultural history of China itself for China's strength. And I'm seeing that in India, of course, and other parts of the world. Now, put that together with the environmental challenges, with the inequalities, with the rapid changes of technology, especially the digital technologies, we're in a period of disruption. We need to keep everything peaceful. This is the most important fact. The West, the United States, not such a peaceful country, unfortunately. It has to learn to be more peaceful, which is something that really is urgent right now. But we're in a period of change, and China's just going to play a huge role in that, and asking for a clear prediction can't be done in the same way as, say, 40 years ago was catching up. This is not about catching up anymore. This is about figuring out a way to live well in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Greetings, I'm Jeff Sachs. I'm president of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network and co-chair of the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition. And it's a great pleasure and honor to join you today, albeit by video, but you can see I'm in a spectacular place in Western Saudi Arabia, in the Hejaz region in Al Ula. And you can also see it's very sunny, and this is a solar superpower. And it's a fitting place for me to say a few words for this important session. I want to thank GuideCo, an organization that I admire tremendously, for bringing us together and for the new report today on pathways to 2030. And I want to thank all of the partner institutions, the UN regional agencies, OLADE, and others for your leadership. We really have a team effort, and we really need a team effort. I'm especially gratified that we are today with many regional organizations, many of the UN regional bodies, and also with GuideCo, which is about energy interconnection. One of the lessons of renewable energy or zero carbon energy systems is that this must be done at a regional scale at a minimum. Of course, GuideCo's vision is a globally interconnected energy system, and I hope we work towards that and achieve that. But at a minimum, we need regional integration. That's OLADE's mission in Latin America. It is the mission of ECLAC or CEPAL. It is the mission of ESQUA for Western Asia. It is the mission of UNECE. It is the mission of ESCAP. It is the mission of UNECA. And it is completely a focus for Secretary General Guterres, as all of you know very, very well. The Council of Engineers of the Energy Transition, which is a body of wonderful engineers from around the world working together towards practical engineering solutions for deep decarbonization and net zero by 2050, met with Secretary General just a couple of days ago. And Secretary General emphasized the need for regional solutions and called on a seat together with all of you, with the regional bodies, with the multilateral development banks, with GuideCo, with OLADE, with other partners to work on regional solutions in each of the main UN regional groupings for Latin America, for Africa, for Western Asia, for Europe, for the Asia Pacific. Please count on me, count on SDSN, count on SEAT, the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, to partner with you. And let's make sure that we work together. GuideCo has given us some very important blueprints, actually for every region of the world, of what an interconnected zero carbon grid can look like. And we know that zero carbon electricity is at the core of decarbonization, because not only does it clean the energy sector, the electricity sector itself, it also enables zero emission transport. It enables zero emission buildings, both commercial and residential. It enables zero carbon hydrogen produced through hydrolyzers using zero carbon electricity. And it enables zero carbon industry, whether directly through electrification or through hydrogen or similar fuel carriers that are themselves zero carbon. One of the points that we are working on very intensively at SDSN and SEAT is financing the pathways in each region. Without practical financing, we can make great plans, but we will not succeed. We know that if long-term, low-cost finance is available, these zero-carbon solutions are actually at parity or even better than the fossil fuel solutions. But they are capital-intensive. They require a tremendous amount of finance. And the market-based financing is not adequate by itself. That's why Secretary General Guterres has called for an SDG stimulus. That's why almost every day I get to say what I'm about to say, and that is we need to scale up the multilateral development banks by factor 5 or more so that they're really doing their job. Because today, if you add up all the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others, the total lending per year is only 100 to 150 billion. It should be at least $500 billion, but really verging on $1 trillion a year. This means a massive scale up. So let me conclude here by saying that with GuideCo, with the regional UN bodies, with the engineers, we can make the pathways to net zero by 2050. This is technologically feasible. It's economically feasible. It makes complete sense for the planet. It needs to be merged with practical financing and implementation plans. And I really hope that for each one of the UN regions, for Latin America, West Africa, Western Asia, Africa, Europe, Asia and the Pacific, that we can make a practical plan of action, a pathway to 2050, together with the technological paths and the financial paths. And I know that GuideCo and the report today will give us crucial knowledge of how to do that. So let me close by thanking all of you. Thanks to GuideCo for bringing us together. Thank you for the report today, and let us work as hard and intensively as we can up to the G20 meeting in September, the UN Mid-SDG Summit in September, and COP28 in the Emirates at the end of November and beginning December, so that we really get in place these financed pathways to net zero by mid-century. Thank you so much.